Hello, and welcome to Talk Relationship to Me, the show that explores some of the most important relationship topics. I'm Dr. Elana Hoffman. As a clinical psychologist, I focus on all things relationships, from dating to sex to long-term relationships to divorce. I cover it all. I use my professional lens as a psychologist as well as lived experience to cover these topics. Do you need to talk relationships? You're in the right place. On today's episode, I am covering why it is so hard to end a relationship and some things that you can do about it. So basically, I'm talking about the art of the breakup and what is really behind the difficulty that people have, or what can be behind the difficulty that people have in ending relationships. So, ending a relationship is a very difficult thing to do, and whether we're talking about after a first date or we are talking about 100 dates or a long-term relationship or a marriage, this is a hard thing. And of course, there are individual reasons why things are difficult, why it's difficult to end the relationships. But I am just going to talk about general patterns that I see sometimes come up with my clients and in my practice. And I wanted to do this episode because I just did an episode on dating myths after divorce. And one of the myths that I sort of debunked was that you are the bad guy if you end the relationship. And I fully think the opposite and have seen the opposite where, things are actually worse the longer you stay in something that deep in your heart and in your soul is not working and there is not a future with someone. Then, you are not the bad guy for ending it. It is in fact the opposite. And, of course, everybody who knows me knows I love a good Sex and the City reference. And so what comes to mind is the episode where Carrie is dating Berger. And of course, like a lot of things, this had red flags from the beginning. However, they were sort of a bit on shaky ground. Jack Berger had said that he wanted a break and he wanted to take some time. She was kind of trying to figure out what she wanted, although actually she was sort of saying, like, why does he want a break? And her friends were saying, you could take this time to think about what you want. And Miranda says, remember you, what do you want? And I really love that because, of course, everybody has agency in their own relationship, and whether or not a relationship is working does not depend on if the other person wants to be with you. Anyway, I could talk about Carrie's anxious attachment for a long time, but basically, Berger comes back and he says, I love you. I want to give this a shot. And then in the end, if you don't know, then Berger breaks up with her on a Post-it. He leaves her apartment and he writes, "I'm sorry, I can't, don't hate me," on a Post-it. Carrie then subsequently goes out to the club with her friends, and she sees his friends at the club, and they didn't know that they broke up. And Carrie says that they broke up, and she says, "Yeah, it was under normal circumstances, it's a Brad breakup, but he broke up with me on a Post-it." And Berger's friend Michael Showalter didn't respond in the way that she wanted him to. And anyway, she goes on a whole rant about how his friend says, there really is no good way to break up with someone. And Carrie goes on a whole rant about actually there is. You can tell a woman directly to her face that you no longer want to see her, and that is okay. And doing that, she says you all need to get over your fear of looking like the bad guy, because here's what not doing that is what makes you the bad guy. And I just really love this scene and what she says. And although she might have gone about it in a, sort of impulsive, not so regulated kind of way, she is not wrong in her message that, ending things directly and kindly is the way to go. But there are very valid reasons why that is difficult to do. So I really wanted to talk about that. And sorry, not sorry for taking 4 minutes to reference Sex and the City. I think the biggest thing, though, is that people stay in relationships. One of the biggest reasons, because they don't want to hurt their partner. Again, whether that is after a few dates or, a long-term relationship, people tell themselves that they're staying because they don't want to disappoint. They don't want to let people down. It's possible they're not used to being kind of the bad guy, quote unquote, right? They're not used to disappointing people in their life. It's hard for them to handle that. maybe they have people pleasing tendencies and they say yes a lot and they sort of do things that they think that they should do. And they really have a hard time letting people down and disappointing someone. And of course, if you end a relationship, you might let someone down and disappoint them and hurt them. And, often what is underneath this is actually connected to attachment and avoidant attachment in particular. I mean, there are anxious attachment reasons why people stay in relationships, and that is another topic. We can cover that in a different episode. But often, a lot of times, what I see is actually rooted in avoidant attachment. So, people have avoidant attachment, and that basically means people who sort of say, I'm really independent in relationships, I don't need anybody, I can do things on my own, have a really hard time being vulnerable, asking for help. They think that emotions and needs, having needs is a weakness when really, shocker, having a need is a human experience. It is just a very human thing to do, to need someone for something. And the people who have avoidant attachment, they sort of grew up in a household or family of origin where their needs were not met in many ways. And so they basically grew up thinking that if they ask for something, they're not going to get it. They're not going to get what they need. They cannot show emotion. Emotion is weakness. Emotion is vulnerable. It's weakness. It's being sort of out of control of things. And so people grow up and have avoidant attachment in relationships. And that means that they don't ask for help. They are not open about what they need. They don't ask for what they need. They have a real hard time being intimate and connecting. Sometimes, sex is the only time that they really sort of connect in that way. And so, but people who grew up, you know, not being able to show emotion and feel emotion and ask for what they need have a really hard time being direct and confronting someone and saying, hey, this isn't working for me. And ultimately, sometimes the root of it is their own discomfort and inability to handle their own emotions in disappointing someone. So often people will say, well, I don't want to hurt this person. They're really not going to be able to handle it if I break up with someone. But actually the truth of the matter is that oftentimes the people who I'm talking to, my clients, if we're talking about this, it actually is not their partner's inability to handle being broken up with. It is their inability to handle their partner's emotions around being broken up with, because they can't handle disappointing someone. They can't handle making someone sad, making someone cry, making someone whatever, breaking someone's heart. I mean, this could run the gamut, of course, of like, I don't want to go on a second date with you, to I'm leaving you after 20 years. And so, but oftentimes if you grow up in a family of origin or a household where you were not able to show emotion and feel emotion and move through these emotions, then you really avoid those intense emotions. And some of those intense emotions can come up when you disappoint someone, if that kind of makes sense. So, I work a lot with my clients on this, feeling their emotions and letting people down in various ways, sitting with the distress of disappointing someone. No, I'm sorry, I can't do this. This extends beyond romantic relationships, and just the idea of kind of, sitting with that discomfort of potentially letting someone down, because, this is, you are a human. And so by virtue of being a human in any kind of relationship, you will likely disappoint someone, whether you mean to or not. Oh, I can't make this dinner. Oh, sorry, I can't do XYZ. Whatever it is, you will disappoint. That's just the nature of it. And so if you try so hard not to do that, that is really when people get in trouble and they find themselves in situations that they really are not fully in, and they stay in relationships for a long time where they know it's not working, for a number of reasons. They're not really into someone. They don't see the same future as them. The other person wants something that they can't give, or vice versa. But they really, really have a hard time handling their own emotions that will come along with disappointing someone, hurting someone. Of course, the other, another big reason is sort of the sunk cost fallacy, right? Like, I've put all this time and effort and energy into this relationship, so, I sort of have to make it work. And that is something that keeps people also in relationships that they know isn't working. Another thing is, of course, you know, pressure around, other people in their lives besides their partners, right? So they again, this is sort of the same process of not wanting to let people down, but it doesn't just apply to their partner. It can apply to their family, their friends, their sort of network of people, their community. It is very difficult to sort of do something a little bit different than what people are expecting of you to do. So, these are reasons that, if you're in a sort of a longer term relationship, can kind of come up when you are thinking about, whether or not you want to stay in the relationship or not. But oftentimes, it starts out, it can be traced back from the beginning of, somebody didn't really want this in the first place, right? And they kind of stayed seeing someone or dating someone because they didn't want to let them down and they didn't want to hurt them. And then oftentimes people find themselves years down the line of in that same situation, but things are much more complicated and there's much more at stake than in the beginning. If they had said after 2 dates, hey, I'm not really interested, I'm not really feeling the connection here, best of luck, right? And that is kind of how I suggest that people end relationships early on, is in a kind and direct way. This isn't really the connection that I'm looking for. It's been great getting to know you, wishing you the best kind of deal. And, it is okay to do that. It is advised to do that if you are really not feeling it. And that's the kind thing to do. If you're not into someone, then let them find someone that is into them. Everybody deserves to be liked and loved and adored and have somebody that is attracted to them and really wants to be with them. And if you are not that person, then it is okay. You're not doing anything wrong. There's nothing, you're not bad, you're not a bad person. You are just letting them go so that they can experience someone else being really into them. And so, that really is, when people start to sort of exercise that muscle of rejecting and being rejected, of course, that's another side of it, then, like anything else, once you exercise a muscle, it gets stronger. And so it's about really being connected to yourself and in tune with yourself and asking yourself, am I really feeling this? What do I want from this? What does this person want? Am I really interested in this person? And being really connected to that and really honest with yourself and really direct with the other person if you don't align on that. But I think that, underneath all of this really is, kind of a wounded person who was not able in childhood to understand their needs and express their needs and get what they want. It looks a certain way from the outside now. It looks like someone is a bad person. And I think that that is, again, a big fear that people are worried about, being the bad person. But really, it is, the things that are going on underneath that is really a lifelong challenge and a lifelong, being told directly or indirectly that, your needs aren't important, your wants aren't important, don't express this emotion. And this can come out really, in this way that feels bad and sort of looks bad, but it is a wound. It is a wound that's very human and tender and needs healing, really, honestly. It needs understanding and acceptance of all the factors that I mentioned today. And of course, these are general observations. Everybody is different, has their own individual experiences. And so, of course, always, you can seek help, a therapist, a coach, lots of books and podcasts and things like that on this kind of thing. If you really are, feeling like some of this applies to you, there's lots of self-development and growth that one can do, to really understand your own patterns. But if this really resonates with you and you feel like you'd really be kind of the bad guy if you walked away from something, really think about your family of origin, the things you were taught about emotion, the things you were taught about attachment. Could you really be yourself? Could you really, you know, ask for what you want and get it and give in a loving and generous way too? And, if not, then that is not something about your character. That's not a character flaw. It is just an experience that over time has contributed to a very difficult time, you know, feeling your feelings and handling overwhelming emotions, from other people. Handling your own emotions in response to other people's emotions, right? Which really, again, is a skill. Emotion regulation is a skill and a muscle, and it is very difficult. But yeah, if you grew up taking care of other people, putting your needs on the back burner, then you might be somebody who in adulthood is really worried about hurting someone else, and that is the driver of the decision. And ultimately, in the end, that is not healthy for either person, right? Again, they deserve someone who is going to be really all about them, and you also deserve to have somebody who you are all about. Or, if that is not what you're looking for at that time, then that is also fine. You don't have to be in a relationship. You don't have to be with someone if you don't want to be. If you really feel like you can't be kind of, who you are and show up in a certain way in a relationship, you don't have to be in one. And I think that there are a lot of messages that tell us otherwise, societally, culturally, religiously, there's lots of drivers, of course, to, couple up and get married and, do the sort of heteronormative thing. Anyway, this is a bit of a bigger topic, but I mean, this is true. These are all sorts of pressures that are very real. So I really wanted to address this, but it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to do that. And so if you feel like you really are hurting someone in the process of this because you're not fully in the relationship, which of course takes a lot of work. I mean, from the beginning, all the way through, healthy, supportive, connected relationships are work. And so it shouldn't be the hardest thing in the world. They should not be so hard, but they require effort, like tending to a garden, and so if you don't want to tend to a garden, then, have some fake plants, right? You shouldn't have a garden. So these are all things to think about, of what makes it hard to end relationships, why people sometimes don't. Again, it's not a villainous thing. Most people are not sociopaths or psychopaths, or, sociopath is not actually a thing. That's not actually a diagnosis. But it is, unhealed childhood stuff that tells people they can't do a certain thing and they have to be a certain way, and it's very hard to sort of go against that. But if you kind of connect with yourself and really connect to what you're looking for and what you want and how you are really, really feeling about a situation, then that can really guide you. You can sort of let your inner wisdom kind of guide these, and you can handle it. You can handle the emotions. The other person certainly can handle it. That's their own stuff. They can seek support however they need to seek support. And if you decide to end a relationship, and that's on them, and it's on you to deal with your feelings about hurting someone. So, if this resonates, let me know. I'm always here for conversation and feedback and thoughts and questions about this. So thank you so much for listening. I think this is actually a really important conversation. I think that, we always say, I'm sorry when people break up, but actually sometimes this can be a very good thing. This has been Talk Relationship to Me, produced by Peach Island Productions. I'm Dr. Elana Hoffman. Do you have a question about relationships? I'd love to hear from you. You can go to my website, drelanahoffman.com, and click contact, or find me on Instagram at dr.elanahoffman. You can find all the info you need, including more about today's episode, in the show description. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, I would love to hear from you. You could inspire a podcast topic. Thank you again, and until next time, just think about Carrie Bradshaw, and if you are curious about that episode, I believe it is season 6. Oh boy, that's going to bother me if I'm wrong. Okay, have a good one, everyone. Thanks for listening.